I'm not going to start singing, even though I look like I am. I want to welcome you here. I'm Judith Arcana. I'm the director of the Union Institute Center for Women, and therefore your host this evening. I'm very glad to see you all here. So the way we're going to do it is this. After Carol Hill Lowe makes her introductory remarks, the speakers will go one after another in the order of the table from my left now, with a simple introduction of their name and their subject. So, without further ado, let me introduce Carol Hill Lowe, the Executive Director of the DC Commission for Women, who has joined with many groups like this over the past several years and knows just what to say to gatherings of this nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I am very honored to be here this evening to be with sisters from around the world in particular, but also sisters who join hands with us, I guess, in our communities, in our homes, in our churches, in our synagogues, you know, all around the world. And it's important that we be here and that we show a sense of connectiveness as sisters from around the world.
I will attempt to sketch the development of the Arab women's movement. From its beginning, the Arab women's movement was inextricably linked to the modernizing and nationalist movement, i.e., most Arab women gained feminist consciousness as a result of their political involvement rather than the other way around. From the early 20th century, Arab women were visible in the struggle against the colonial powers. In Egypt, Lebanon, Palestine, and many other Arab countries, women-led demonstrations were commonplace in the 1920s. In the early 1920s, women organized around suffragette agendas. They removed their veils and were very vocal in pressuring for the education of women, their participation in the workforce, and asking for their political rights. The first woman to remove her veil was Huda Sha'arawi. She did so in Cairo, Egypt in 1923. She was soon followed by other Arab women all over the Arab world. Now, to a large extent, the Arab women's movement has been a linear movement with incremental gains for women over the years. As countries were gaining their independence, women were gaining their political rights and were more and more visible. In fact, in most Arab countries, we have women members of parliament, we have women cabinet ministers, we have women businesswomen, we have women writers, poets, artists, as you can see around, in all walks of life. In the 1970s, Lebanon, for example, could boast that it had achieved parity in education between boys and girls. Last year's statistics show that that women represented on the average 42% of the student body all over the Arab world. A remarkable achievement if one considers that in a number of Arab countries there were no schools for girls up until the 1960s. Now let's discuss briefly some of the problems with the Arab women's movement. We are often criticized by Western feminists in particular for our over-politicization. They say we're overly political. This is true. This is true because we live in a period of social transformation in most Arab countries, war situation in some, and liberal struggles in others. We realize the necessity for social change and the importance of women's issues. Yet the political overrides our social concerns. Who can expect the Lebanese woman, for example, who's been living for the last 16 years in a situation of civil war, to be concerned primarily about her condition as a woman, when she, like everybody in her family, are struggling to make ends meet, are struggling for mere survival? Who can expect the Palestinian woman, who has been living for the last 24 years under occupation, to be basically concerned about herself as a woman, when again she, like every other member of her family, is facing oppression? Our priorities cannot be the priorities of other women who are living in the peaceful, developed world. We are also criticized for our insistence on the family. And that's true too. One cannot overemphasize the importance of the family when it comes to the Arab. Not only does the family give us warmth, but for us, in a way, as a friend of mine called Professor Aida Bami at Florida University calls it, it's our health and life insurance policies. And we devote a lot of time to the family. But the family gives us the feeling that we will not be sick alone, that we will not die alone. And in the third world, in the absence of institutions that provide this kind of insurance, the family remains extremely important. One should notice also that in third world contexts where there are no daycare centers, where there are no fast food stores, the family actually is not an impediment to progress. On the contrary, it can allow some women who otherwise would not be able to work to participate in the public life, because these women can leave their children, for example, with their mothers when there are no daycare centers. They don't have to rush back home to fix dinner.
When we speak about the Arabs or the Arab world in general, some of you may think of a religion, of some former European colonies or third world countries. Some of you may think of the Muslims, of wounded Lebanon, of the Palestinians, of terrorism, of even Iran, which is not an Arab country, of the Crusaders, consciously and most of the time unconsciously, of the Arab-Israeli conflict, or more recently, of the Gulf Sheikhs, of the Kurds, and of Iraq's Saddam. When we speak about women in the Arab world, some may think of veiled, illiterate, and or oppressed women. Some of you may think of polygamy, inequality, and or of sexism, or of belly dancers even, of Shahrazad, or of a certain perception of Shahrazad and Arabian Nights, or of patriarchy. As an Arab Muslim girl, and later as a woman, I was given contradictory messages. On the one hand, I was told that my Arab Muslim tradition encouraged both men and women to learn, to be educated. Since the first word of the Quran, the divine message for Muslims, is read meaning also think. The pursuit of knowledge is the most striking feature of my upbringing. I have been told that the word knowledge, in fact, and its derivatives, and we all know that the word knowledge is not neutral. This word occurred, according to an Arab Muslim scholar, 880 times in the Quran. For me, growing up, the pursuit of knowledge is a reason to become autonomous, free, independent, true to oneself and to the others, in an effort to be part of a universe or a world of equality, peace, and justice. Yet, and on the other hand, I learned that in general, women in the Arab world, there are of course exceptions, but generally speaking, women in the Arab world inherit half of a man's share because of the old belief that men are the only providers for their families. I was also told that in Islamic courts, 2 women testimony equal 1 man's testimony because women are too emotional or because they are not able to remember events in an accurate or precise way. But I also learned that according to our legal traditions, that a marriage is a contract between a man and a woman who are supposed to be equal in stipulating whatever conditions acceptable by both of them. This is the legal traditions. But of course, we will speak later about the gap between the practices and legal tradition. Let us think together about the common basis of sexism with both racism, ethnocentrism, and the professional elitism or money elitism. Let us think about our definition of what we call the University of Women's issue. Does it allow Western women and or any group of women to have the right to dictate the pace of any women's reform in third world countries? Let us try to see how we can link the different variables when we talk about women in different parts of the world. Historical factors, political, international, etc. Let us think of it in terms of the power struggle.
What can be done? What can one do to combat this problem of anti-Arab feelings in this country? I think as far as I'm concerned, it's very important for me to be very specific about the stereotypes that exist in this culture about Arabs and who holds those stereotypes and how can one begin to reverse these stereotypes that have become such basic cornerstones in the discussions of Arabs in this country. Let me share with you, in the spirit of dialogue, and I'm sure I'll get lots of questions about this. My understanding of a particular stereotype, a particularly pernicious stereotype of Arab culture in the U.S., one that views that culture and its men as barbaric and treacherous, largely because they mistreat women. This particular stereotype, as a telephone poll that was conducted in 1980 tells us, is widely held by American women. More American women believe that Arab culture is barbaric, treacherous, not to be trusted, largely because it mistreats women. A minority of American women think that Arab cultures are friendly or have friendly feelings to that particular culture. In other words, we're really dealing with a gender gap in the way men I should say, American men and women view Arab culture. Whereas men tend to be split in their attitudes towards Arab culture, American women on the whole, 3/4 of at least the American women included in that particular poll had a very low opinion of Arab culture. Now, I must tell you, I was surprised by that particular finding. I think as far as the kind of work that I've done, what I have been doing so far, was led to believe that those stereotypes, that particular stereotype, is one that men invested quite a bit of energy into, and that women's belief in that stereotype was really a carryover from the kinds of attitudes and assumptions that are made by men, who after all have greater exposure to other cultures than women in this country. Now, while on the surface, I should point this out, on the surface this sounds like American women are prejudiced in their attitudes towards Arab men. But of course, if one thinks about it, there are implications to the attitudes that American women have towards Arab men that of course influence their image of Arab women. If we believe that Arab men are mean to Arab women, are villains as far as their treatment of Arab women, then of course we're more inclined to think of Arab women as victims, unable to resist their own oppression, unable to fight their own cultures and to introduce changes in those attitudes that men and the culture have towards them. We are most probably also inclined to pity them and to think that most probably they need our help to liberate themselves, that somehow they are not able to do that themselves. This is, of course, not a very flattering characterization. It's a characterization that Arab women have rejected very fiercely in polemics with Western women. It's, however, an image that persists and continues, seems to have a life of its own, despite the protestations of Arab women to the contrary. Now, this leads me to a very difficult paradox, a tricky paradox, and that is, and this I don't really want to get into too much, maybe you can discuss it during the question and answer period, is that if we really wanted to fight the stereotype of Arab women, we must change our image of Arab men, that there is no way. The two images are so connected to one another that there's no way of changing the image of an Arab woman unless we change also, unless we humanize Arab men as well.
Now, in 1967, when the West Bank was occupied by Israel, men in general were in a state of daze, because this was a defeat, of course, for many ideologies that were being discussed at the time, like Arabism and Marxism and other ideologies. But someone had to meet the demands of the population. A lot of people were refugees, and for those of you who read My Home, My Prison by Raimonda Tawil, there's an interesting description of the refugees around Raimonda's home. It is at this moment that women's role began to emerge. Raimonda Tawil, who is a publisher of a magazine on Palestine that emerges out of this in Washington called Return, and a friend of hers who since then has become the author of 5 novels. One of her novels is being sold by Lama Books. Her name is Sahar Khalifi. Went out and decided that they are going to take matters into their hand. They asked Israeli soldiers to open up UNRWA warehouses and so that they could feed these population. Now, there was a lot of squabbling about among the men in this conservative town of Nablus, who thought that the women should not be riding around with the Israeli soldiers, and they were criticized. But the women said, look, we have had enough of all the isms that were discussed. and all the criticism and tradition. Now we have all these mouths to feed, and somebody has to do something about it. I'm bringing this as an example of the pragmatic approach of women's organizations since '67. And this does not mean that the women's groups are not politicized. Every single group belongs to a faction of the PLO. However, their approach is pragmatic, and it's geared towards feeding people on the West Bank. The first women's organizations were social welfare types, where wealthy women went into less fortunate or poorer areas and taught these women how to do sewing, the traditional embroidery centers, secretarial work, and helped them support themselves. The largest organization is called In'ash al-Usra. There are about, when it closed down in the Intifada, In'ash al-Usra was feeding about 50,000 people. Now, in the late 70s, a new form of women's organization emerged. These were called the Women's Work Committees, and these were run differently, from the bottom up. Women have become heads of households, did not want to receive orders from above, and this new form of organizational structure basically dealt with asking women what it is you want to do, and the women's work committees provided women with the materials to do so. Many of them developed cooperatives, canning cooperatives that became very useful during the Intifada. When the Intifada started, the women had the organizational know-how and were ready to cooperate in yet a third form of organizations that evolved then, and these were called popular committees. The new and third stage were mixed. There were no longer separate women working separately from men. It was young teenage girls who would go into the homes during the Intifada, during curfews, find out what these homes needed, and then provided them with that kind of, or with the materials needed. Every quarter has 4 or 5 different popular committees. Each committee deals with a different form of requirement. Some teach school children, since the Intifada, the schools have been closed, in their home. So they've developed a clandestine education system. Others have developed a system of medical aid. The only committee that does not have over 50% women is the one that you see on television, and that's the defense committee, the kids throwing stones. Presumably the women cannot run as fast. What's the future for women in a new state? I think that it will be somewhat different than the Algerian experience, because women are really building the infrastructures of the new state. They were there building the organizations of what will become future system of education. They were there building the future social welfare organizations through the first and second form of women's groups.
You mentioned the promise of the 60s, that this resurgence was because of the failure of that promise. And I was interested to know more about that, what you viewed that promise as.
The promises of the policies of development, for example, I mean, until the 1970s, in the third world in general, I mean, there seemed to be an easy recipe to development. I mean, it had 2 components, basically. You had to have education, mainly education, and I mean, let's discuss education, which is the most important. So what happened in most of the Arab world was the opening up of all these schools to educate boys and girls, and particularly women. People expected that everything would change when people would acquire education. Well, there were a number of problems with that. First, we took the system of formal education from the West as is. To a great extent, this is making a terrible sound, to a great extent that system leads to fallouts of girls and boys at every level of education. The promise that people invest in their children, that their education is going to change their life, that it's going to give them better opportunities, did not really materialize. That's on one level. On the other level, rural schools could never compete with urban schools, for example. So the education that girls in rural areas were getting was not at all comparable to the one in urban areas. So rural girls could never compete with urban girls. Then these rural girls who did make it up to the high school level and would come to universities in Cairo, for example. Now they would have to compete with the women of Cairo on very many levels. And this is where there was a conservative reaction in dressing, for example. When they look at these urban girls, beautifully dressed women, they cannot compete with them. They don't have the money or the know-how to compete with them. So they would take the Islamic dress and to protect themselves from that competition. But the expectations did not materialize. I mean, there is now a whole revision of the education and its value to the development of our countries on very many levels. I mean, is it worth it, is the question. Is it worth it to invest in a girl to get a primary education, become alienated from her rural area? And how is her getting a primary education in any way going to improve her chances in life? When in the meantime she could have been helping at home, for example. And all this now has created a whole process of revision for all these theories of development and their effects. And in a way it has led to a conservative reaction, I would say.
I mean, in the colonial context, obviously, the colonizers presented their own culture as more enlightened, as more civilized, and therefore, in the case of the Arab culture, of course, it was viewed as I said, very oppressive to women and not as enlightened as Western culture viewed itself. Of course, the problem with that is that it ignores the historical experience that women, as well as racial and sexual minorities, have had in those enlightened cultures. And of course, we do know that those cultures also discriminated as well as persecuted many of those groups as well. And therefore, colonialism as a relationship of power imposed on non-Western cultures definitions that or stereotypes of those cultures that put them in a subordinate position to the dominant cultures that were largely European in origin.
The Institute for Arab Women Studies here in Washington, we conducted a study of the way in which the culture perceived the participation of women, and that relates to language. We did a study of images of Palestinian women in the Intifada in poetry, in folklore, and in novels. And it seemed to us that men who write poetry have not changed their image of Arab women, of Palestinian women. They still talk about women's participation in the Intifada, but what they focus on are the biological aspects of the beautiful long hair and the thin waist, or they perceive women in their biological role as mothers, and that novelists and short story writers, men who write novels and short stories, have done a lot better. And they're starting to see a greater relationship between women's role on the ground and in novels. Best of all are the anecdotes or the folklore, the little stories that have evolved, some of them true, some of them we don't know how they came about the braveries of women, older women who hide the little child underneath her skirt, and when the soldiers look for the child, they can't find him. Or other anecdotes where a soldier grabs a kid and the woman walks over and says, "This is my child," and the woman has never seen the child before, and she tears him away from the soldier, and 5 minutes later she asks him, "Who's your mother?" or something like that. These anecdotes really reflect women's activities, most of all. And the problem is that literary canons take a while, especially poetic canons, take a while to change, and the images in one's subconscious also take a very long time, which is where poetry emanates from.
I just want to add one thing, just so that people are not left with the impression that Arab women participation in literature is only in the 1950s. One important incident that happened in 1925, when Lebanese women actually demonstrated to the whole of the book, the whole which has the pictures of all the famous writers in Lebanon, and the demonstration, the purpose of the demonstration was to include in the hall the picture of women literary figures, and the first woman that was included her name was Warda Jazairiya. She had written in 1870.
I'd like to hear some more discussion of the topic brought up by one of the speakers on the Gulf War and the images of Arab women here. And I think particularly what you brought up about the kind of confusing and contradictory positions of some progressive and feminist organizations who were opposed to the war, but at the same time perpetuated some of those images. I mean, I think that's something that would be good to discuss, and it's also, those are the kind of organizations that I think people in this room might have the most impact on in terms of promoting some of the dialogue.
Okay, as I said, in terms of now's position on the Gulf War, the political position itself was a good one. The rationalization, the explanation of why that position ended up with perpetuating the image of the Middle East as a very homogeneous social system of gender apartheid. And gender apartheid, I mean, as far as I can tell, really refer to sexual segregation. Sexual segregation isn't just something that the Middle East had monopoly over. Sexual segregation existed in different parts of the world. And of course, sexual segregation does not exist in most of the other Arab countries. It's only the Gulf states that exercise some degree of sexual segregation. And even as far as the Gulf states are concerned, there's quite a bit of variance in their practice of sexual segregation, so that we can't even use that concept to characterize in some accurate way the role that women play in those systems. And then, of course, in describing this system as the most brutal, or as in representing a system that is so purely brutal that we end up thinking of, again, those systems as being the most oppressive to women in the world. And of course, that takes us again to the image of women as victims.
I found it very interesting that you would say that in order for the image of the Arab woman to change, that you must change the image of the Arab man. As an African American woman, I find that to be true of African American men and women, and I appreciate that comment. But I have a question regarding the existence of racism within Arab culture, and just as a question, wondering if it does exist, and if it does exist, how does that play itself out in relation to class issues, and how that is tied to how people are treated in terms of class.
To make sure that we understand each other correctly on this point, because I realize that's going to be a very, most probably a very divisive point, or controversial somehow. I don't think that one should blame men for the system of inequality that exists. They are beneficiaries of this particular system, which is patriarchy. But it's a mistake to think that all men equally benefit from the privileges that patriarchy has, and that, of course, not all of them are as invested in its preservation or its continuation as some others. And therefore, it's very important to keep in mind those real distinctions. But I don't have any doubt in my mind that, of course, one needs to blame patriarchy for this, and that there is a system, a patriarchal system that operates in the Middle East, and that is, of course, very different from the patriarchal system that operates in this country, and we need to deal with these as two different patriarchal systems. I think that this is more promising. Rather than, I can't also imagine how you can evaluate how one patriarchal system is more oppressive than the other. All of them are very repressive of women, and of course, women suffer the burdens of those systems very intensely, regardless of whether or not one is more benevolent than the other. So that's why I say that it's very important. It's very important to put the blame where it belongs, which is on the patriarchal systems that exist in different societies. On the question, of course, of racism or prejudice that is connected to color. In most of the Middle East, there is no institutionalized system of racism, and therefore it does not exist as a phenomenon, as an institutional phenomenon. But there is, of course, color prejudice. In Egypt, which is my country of origin, until very recently, dark-skinned people had less access to education as well as to mobility, and so that does exist. As a historical legacy, but it's not an institutionalized legacy, which makes a big difference, I think, between how that operates and works in Egypt, for instance, and how it works in this country. It's the combined influence of both race and class that explains why certain groups have an easier time of integrating in the system rather than others.
Yeah, I want to comment on that, even though I agree with Mervat, except that the notion of race in the Arab world is different than what we know as race here, because of the history of the Arab world. We have been really between all kind of continents, all kind of races. Then it's a mixture of all kind of things, and I don't think that Mervat put it well in terms of the color, because it's the shades and degrees. But I tend to think that more than what is called race, it's the economic, the social and economic classes. And it so happened that in the south, in the Said, for instance, it's not all Said. I come from Said, for example, Upper Egypt, which is the most traditional and poor, etc. But we had many powerful families in Said who were dark-skinned and had power because they had money, they had land, they had, all kind of privileges. But I guess Mervat was thinking of Nubia, which is part of Egypt in the south, which was basically black Egyptians who lived there, and they were very poor, and they didn't have access to education until recently.
No, I didn't just think of Nubia. I mean, clearly Nubia is included, but at the same time, I was thinking that as you mentioned, obviously, if certain dark-skinned families had
there is
money,
individual racism, yes.
No, I call it color prejudice, but at the same time, obviously, dark-skinned families that had money were able to escape the stigma associated with dark-skinned color. But those, however, that did not have access to that tended to be underprivileged in terms of access to education, other employment offered by the central government and so on. So it's a question of your integrating an understanding of color prejudice with class that determines for you who has access to what.
So it's just time to say thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to our distinguished panel. Thanks to Olive Gallery, to Lama Zijani and her staff. And for me personally, thank you to all of the Union Institute staff who helped support me through the putting together of this whole event. Thank you all. I hope you